Welcome, and close the heavy wooden doors behind you. Medieval convents were meant to be places of silence, prayer, and purity, but history whispers a more complicated story. Between the 12th and 15th centuries, these sacred walls sheltered devotion, ambition, and sometimes scandal. Nuns took vows of chastity and obedience, yet records from church courts reveal forbidden romances, secret pregnancies, and quiet rebellions against rigid rules. Abbesses could wield real power, managing lands and wealth, while younger women, often placed there by their families, struggled between faith and confinement. In 1317, Pope John XX even issued reforms after reports of moral corruption spread through certain convents. These were not simply tales of sin, but of humanity pressed into holiness. Behind stone walls and candlelight lived women negotiating belief, desire, and survival. Today, we uncover the hidden lives of medieval convents, where secrets lingered, and virtue was rarely as simple as it seemed. On a frost-covered morning in January 1115, 12 noblewomen dressed in rough woolen habits processed through the gates of Fontevraud Abbey in the Loire Valley, their breath visible in the cold air as they chanted the Te Deum. Among them was Hersende de Champagne, a widow who had rejected 3 marriage proposals to join this revolutionary new monastery. Fontevraud was unlike anything medieval Europe had seen before, a double monastery housing both men and women, ruled not by an abbot, but by an abbess. Within a generation, it would command vast estates across France, operate hospitals and schools, and count queens and princesses among its residents. This was the paradox of medieval convents, institutions designed to remove women from worldly power that became, ironically, some of the only places where women could wield it. The explosion of convents across medieval Europe was no accident of piety, but a calculated response to intersecting social, economic, and religious forces. When the Benedictine reform movement swept through 11th century Europe, it carried with it a renewed emphasis on monastic life as the highest form of Christian devotion. But this spiritual revival coincided with a demographic crisis among the nobility. Families were producing more daughters than they could profitably marry off, and the Church's newly enforced rules against consanguinity made finding suitable matches even harder. Bernard of Clairvaux, writing in 1140, noted with characteristic bluntness that noble families burden themselves with daughters as a farmer burdens himself with excess livestock. The solution was elegant: transform surplus daughters into brides of Christ. Between 1000 and 1300, the number of female religious houses in England alone grew from roughly 50 to over 140, while German territories saw the establishment of more than 500 new convents. The Cistercian order, which had initially refused to accept women, reversed course in 1213, when they realized the economic potential wealthy families would endow entire monasteries to house their daughters, providing land, income, and political influence. These institutions quickly evolved beyond mere repositories for inconvenient women. The Convent of Las Huelgas in Burgos, Spain, founded in 1187 by Eleanor of England, became so powerful that its abbess held quasi-episcopal authority, exempting her from the jurisdiction of local bishops. She could appoint priests, hear confessions, and grant absolution powers that male clerics envied and resented. The German abbess Hildegard of Bingen, who founded her own monastery at Rupertsberg in 1150, corresponded with popes and emperors as an equal, offering political counsel and theological insights. When the Archbishop of Mainz tried to assert authority over her foundation, Hildegard wrote a scathing letter, reminding him that her monastery answered only to God and the Pope, adding pointedly that God works through whomever he chooses, even vessels the world considers weak. By the 13th century, convents controlled approximately 1/5 of all agricultural land in parts of France and owned forests, mills, vineyards, and urban properties that generated enormous wealth. The Abbey of Quedlinburg in Saxony possessed mining rights, minted its own coins, and maintained an army its abbess ranked as an imperial princess with a seat in the imperial diet. Yet the path to the convent was rarely straightforward, and the motivations of women who entered these institutions were as varied as the women themselves. For every genuinely pious girl who yearned for spiritual communion, there were 3 or 4 forced by family circumstance. When Eleanor de Montfort entered Amesbury Priory in 1285, she was following her widowed mother, but court records reveal that her father's estate had been bankrupted by debts, and the family could not afford her dowry. The convent accepted her with a reduced donation of lands in Somerset. Christina of Marciate, whose dramatic life was recorded in a 12th century Vita, had to flee her family home disguised as a man when her parents tried to force her into marriage, hiding with a hermit for years before finally being allowed to enter religious life on her own terms. Her struggle highlighted a cruel irony. Society praised virginity and religious devotion in theory, but often punished women who actually chose it over family interests. The economic mechanics of convent entry shaped the entire institution. Noble families paid substantial dowries to prestigious houses. The convent of San Pier Maggiore in Florence charged 1,000 florins in 1320, equivalent to a prosperous merchant's annual income. These payments weren't simply donations, but investments in the family's spiritual portfolio and social standing. Having a daughter in a prominent convent brought prestige, created useful connections with other noble families whose daughters resided there, and perhaps most cynically removed a potential drain on the inheritance. The practice became so commercialized that some convents developed explicit fee structures: basic admission, fees for a private cell, additional charges for bringing a servant, premiums for positions like cellaress or choir mistress. The Benedictine House of Essen in Westphalia required proof of 16 noble ancestors for admission, while the Cistercian Abbey of Saint Cloistered in Metz accepted only women who could document royal lineage. This exclusivity created a 2-tier system: wealthy aristocratic houses where women lived in relative comfort and maintained many privileges of their class, and poorer institutions where women from merchant or minor gentry families lived in genuine austerity. Daily life within convent walls followed rhythms established by the rule of Benedict in the 6th century, which structured each day around 8 prayer services from matins at 2 in the morning to Compline at sunset. At the Cistercian Abbey of Port Royal in France, the nuns rose in absolute darkness, processing silently to the chapel in their white habits, breath-forming clouds in the unheated church. They slept in their clothing on straw mattresses in unheated dormitories, ate in silence while one sister read aloud from scripture, and spoke only during designated recreation periods. The rule prescribed manual labor: spinning, weaving, illuminating manuscripts, tending gardens, caring for the sick. At the Abbey of Sainte-Croix in Poitiers, founded by the Merovingian Queen Radegund in 560, nuns copied classical manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost, preserving works of Virgil, Ovid, and early Christian writers. The convent scriptorium employed 20 full-time scribes by the 12th century, producing books for sale that generated substantial income. Yet this idealized vision of ordered piety existed in constant tension with human reality and institutional pragmatism. While rules mandated poverty, many aristocratic nuns maintained private apartments, brought servants, and dined on fine foods their families sent. Inspection records from the Diocese of Lincoln in 1440 reveal that at Godstow Abbey, the nuns wore silk veils, kept pet dogs, and entertained visitors in the parlor with wine and pastries. At Romsey Abbey in Hampshire, the sacrist's account books from 1333 show purchases of fur-trimmed habits, expensive embroidered altar cloths, and 3 pounds of ginger and a gallon of hippocras for the abbess's table. The contrast between the Benedictine ideal of communal poverty and the lived reality of aristocratic privilege created constant friction. Reformers periodically attempted to restore strict observance. The Observantine movement of the 15th century sought to eliminate private property and luxury within convents, but resistance was fierce. When reform was imposed on the convent of San Lorenzo in Florence in 1493, several nuns literally barricaded themselves in their private chambers, refusing to surrender their jewelry, fine clothing, and personal funds. The tension between enclosure and autonomy defined women's monastic experience. Church law increasingly mandated strict clausura, the complete separation of nuns from the outside world. The papal bull, Periculoso, issued by Pope Boniface VIII in 1298, ordered all female religious to remain permanently enclosed, neither leaving the convent nor receiving visitors without explicit permission. The stated purpose was protecting female virtue, but the practical effect was curtailing women's independence and economic power. Yet enforcement proved nearly impossible. Abbesses who managed vast estates needed to travel to inspect properties, negotiate contracts, and appear in courts. The abbess of Shaftesbury in England controlled the town's market rights, collected rents from hundreds of tenants, and sat in judgment over civil disputes responsibilities incompatible with strict enclosure. When authorities tried to enforce clausura at the wealthy abbey of Quedlinburg in 1487, the abbess successfully appealed directly to Emperor Frederick III, arguing that her administrative duties required freedom of movement. The emperor sided with her, exempting Quedlinburg from enclosure rules. Education within convents created another paradox. Nuns were among medieval Europe's most educated women, often literate in Latin when most men outside the clergy could not read their own language. The Abbey of Argenteuil near Paris operated a school that educated daughters of the nobility alongside oblates children dedicated to religious life by their families. Heloise, the brilliant scholar who became abbess of the Paraclete in the 12th century, had been educated at Argenteuil before her infamous affair with Peter Abelard. After taking vows, she established a rigorous educational program, teaching not only Latin and scripture, but also classical literature, music, and medicine. Her letters reveal a woman of formidable intellect who debated theology with the era's leading scholars. Yet this education came with severe restrictions. Nuns could learn and teach but could not preach, could not administer sacraments, could not hold theological authority over men. As Heloise herself wrote with bitter irony, "We are permitted to know all things except to speak of them." The political power that abbesses wielded often brought them into direct conflict with male ecclesiastical authorities who resented female autonomy. When the abbess of Fontevraud attempted to depose a corrupt prior in 1247, the Archbishop of Tours intervened, claiming abbesses had no authority over male religious despite the monastery's founding charter explicitly granting such power. The dispute reached Pope Innocent IV, who sided with the abbess, reaffirming that Fontevraud's unique constitution placed all residents, male and female, under the abbess's absolute authority. Similar battles erupted across Europe. The abbess of Gandersheim in Saxony fought a decades-long jurisdictional war with the Bishop of Hildesheim, each excommunicating the other's supporters in a conflict that required imperial mediation. These were not petty squabbles but fundamental questions about women's capacity to exercise spiritual and temporal authority. When Bishop Guillaume Durand attempted to conduct a visitation at the powerful abbey of Saint-Antoine-des-Champs in Paris in 1336, the abbess refused him entry, bolted the gates, and wrote to the Pope challenging the bishop's jurisdiction. The ensuing legal battle lasted 3 years and established important precedents for abbatial independence. Some abbesses governed with a political sophistication that rivaled secular rulers. Matilda of Quedlinburg, who served as abbess from 966 to 999, acted as regent for her nephew, Emperor Otto III, conducting diplomacy, commanding military forces, and presiding over imperial councils. The abbey's chronicle records that she negotiated a peace treaty with Slavic tribes, mediated disputes between German princes, and founded 2 daughter houses that extended Quedlinburg's influence. In 13th century Spain, the abbess of Las Huelgas controlled 17 towns, 50 villages, and multiple monasteries, appointing their abbesses and collecting taxes. She maintained her own court, issued legal judgments, and knighted noblemen, a privilege usually reserved for kings and military orders. When King Alfonso X had to assert royal authority over Las Huelgas in 1279, the abbess successfully petitioned Pope Nicholas III to confirm the convent's exemptions, preserving its extraordinary autonomy for another 2 centuries. Yet for all their power, abbesses remained women in a profoundly patriarchal institution. They could command estates and subjects but could not celebrate Mass, hear confessions, or grant absolution functions they depended on male priests to perform. They lived in a liminal space, wielding authority that theoretically violated the Church's teachings about female subordinacy while simultaneously reinforcing the Church's monopoly on spiritual power. The Benedictine abbess Euphemia of Wierwille, who governed her English house from 1226 to 1257, exemplified this contradiction. She skillfully managed the abbey's finances, rebuilt its church, and expanded its holdings. Yet her seal depicted her kneeling before Christ rather than seated in authority like abbot seals. Even at the height of their power, abbesses had to negotiate carefully between claiming the authority their positions required and maintaining the humility their gender demanded. The morning of the 15th of March, 1623, began like any other at the Theatine Convent in Pescia, a small Tuscan town nestled in the hills between Florence and Lucca. The nuns filed into chapel for lauds, their white habits rustling in the pre-dawn darkness. But when Benedetta Carlini, the 33-year-old abbess, began to convulse during the Magnificat, her body arching backward as she cried out in a voice not her own, the routine shattered. "I am Splenditello," she proclaimed, "an angel sent from heaven to dwell within this vessel." For the next 2 years, Benedetta would claim visitations from multiple celestial beings, exhibit bleeding stigmata, and attract pilgrims from across Tuscany until an investigation revealed that her mystical raptures concealed a passionate sexual relationship with a younger nun named Bartolomea Crivelli. The case would expose not a simple tale of forbidden love, but a labyrinth of desire, power, manipulation, and the razor-thin line between religious ecstasy and carnal hunger that defined life behind convent walls. Illicit relationships within convents were far more common than church authorities cared to admit, and they took forms as varied as human desire itself. In 1384, the Bishop of Winchester's visitation to Wierwille Abbey uncovered that the prioress, Isabella Winchestra, had been conducting a long-term affair with a local chaplain named William Haynes. The bishop's register records with evident distaste that Haynes frequents the monastery by day and night and has carnal knowledge of the prioress in her private chamber, adding that several nuns had witnessed the couple's indiscretions. The scandal deepened when investigators discovered that Isabella had borne Haynes a child 3 years earlier, sending the infant to be raised by a wet nurse in a nearby village under the pretense that it was an orphan the abbey had charitably adopted. Similar cases proliferated across medieval Europe. At the Cistercian Abbey of Villers in Brabant, the 1270 visitation revealed that 3 nuns had become pregnant by the abbey's confessor, a Franciscan friar named Jacques, who had exploited his position to seduce women under his spiritual guidance. The friar's defense that the women had tempted him with their beauty and he had fallen prey to their wiles exemplified the tendency to blame women for men's transgressions, a pattern that would repeat throughout centuries of convent scandals. Yet not all forbidden relationships followed the predictable pattern of male clerics seducing vulnerable nuns. The 1405 investigation of the Benedictine Convent of Wotton in Yorkshire revealed an intricate web of same-sex relationships that scandalized investigators. The prioress, Joan of Leeds, was found to have maintained particular friendships with several younger nuns, sleeping in their cells and exchanging gifts of jewelry and embroidered linens. The visitation record delicately describes unnatural affections and impure embraces, language that barely veiled accusations of lesbian relationships. When questioned, several nuns testified that such relationships were common and had been tacitly tolerated for years. One elderly nun stated that, "In my 40 years within these walls, I have seen more love between women than chastity," a remarkable admission that suggests widespread acceptance of what church law condemned. The case of Sister Benedetta Carlini in Pescia provides even more explicit documentation. When investigators finally interrogated Bartolomea Crivelli in 1623, she testified in extraordinary detail about their 2-year sexual relationship, describing how Benedetta had fashioned a wooden dildo she called the young boy and used it during their encounters. claiming all the while that she was possessed by a male angel named Splenditello who compelled these acts. Bartolommea's testimony, preserved in the Florentine archives, is one of the most detailed accounts of lesbian sexuality in the pre-modern era. She described how Benedetta would visit her cell at night, speaking in the angel's voice, insisting that their physical union was divinely ordained. The investigators seemed almost more disturbed by the blasphemous mixing of the sacred and sexual than by the acts themselves. Aristocratic benefactors also found their way into convent beds with surprising frequency. The wealthy Venetian nobleman Marco Barbaro maintained a notorious relationship with Sister Andriana Savorgnan of the convent of Sant'Angelo di Contorta throughout the 1,490 seconds, visiting her regularly in a private apartment she maintained within the cloister. Barbaro's account books, discovered in the Venetian state archives, show regular payments for gifts to my beloved A.S., including expensive fabrics, jewelry, perfumes, and even a clavichord for her private entertainment. When the affair was finally investigated in 1509, it emerged that Savorgnan had borne Barbaro 2 children, both of whom had been quietly placed with noble families and raised as wards. The scandal was explosive. Barbaro was one of Venice's leading citizens, a member of the Great Council, yet both escaped serious punishment. Savorgnan was transferred to a stricter convent and deprived of her private apartment, while Barbaro paid a fine and performed public penance. The leniency reflected the reality that powerful families could often negotiate outcomes that ordinary people could not. At the convent of San Zaccaria in Venice, matters went even further. The institution became infamous as a repository for noblewomen who had no religious vocation but were placed there by families seeking to consolidate estates. By the 16th century, San Zaccaria operated almost like a genteel boarding house where aristocratic women received male visitors, attended social gatherings, and lived in open violation of their vows. The Venetian diarist Marino Sanudo wrote in 1509 that San Zaccaria is more bordello than monastery, where noble ladies entertain their paramours with no more shame than courtesans of the Rialto. The intertwining of mysticism and sexuality created particularly volatile situations where genuine religious experience, mental illness, loving desire, and demonic possession became impossible to distinguish. Benedetta Carlini claimed that her angel Splenditello appeared in radiant light, commanded her to perform acts of mortification, and also initiated sexual contact with her companion Bartolomea, a bewildering mixture of the sacred and profane. Her case was hardly unique. In 1491, a young nun named Catherine of Racconighi in Piedmont began experiencing ecstatic visions in which Christ appeared to her in the form of a beautiful young man who embraced her, kissed her, and spoke words of love. Her confessor, initially convinced of her sanctity, grew suspicious when Catherine's descriptions became increasingly loving, dwelling on Christ's physical beauty and the sensual pleasure of his touch. An investigation concluded that Catherine was either deluded or possessed, and she was isolated in a cell where she eventually recanted her visions, claiming they had been fantasies born of loneliness and desire. The case raised troubling questions. Where did genuine mystical experience end and sexual fantasy begin? The Church's own language of divine love employed deeply sensual imagery, the bride of Christ, the soul's union with God, the ecstasy of divine communion that could easily shade into passion. Saint Teresa of Avila's famous description of her mystical experience with an angel, written in the 16th century, was so overtly sexual that later artists portrayed it with unmistakable loving overtones. She described the angel plunging a golden spear into her heart repeatedly, causing a pain so great that I screamed aloud. But simultaneously, I felt such infinite sweetness that I wished the pain to last eternally. Accusations of demonic possession provided a convenient explanation for behaviors that challenged religious and sexual norms. When the nuns of Loudun in France began experiencing convulsions, speaking in tongues, and making obscene gestures in 1632, ecclesiastical authorities diagnosed collective demonic possession. The subsequent investigation and trial of the convent's priest, Urbain Grandier, became one of history's most notorious cases of supposed diabolical influence. The nuns testified that Grandier had sent demons to possess them, forcing them to commit sexual acts and blasphemies against their will. During exorcisms, they shrieked, contorted their bodies into impossible positions, and spoke in what witnesses claimed were ancient languages. Modern historians debate whether the outbreak represented mass hysteria, political conspiracy, Grandier had powerful enemies, sexual repression manifesting as collective delusion, or deliberate fraud. Regardless, Grandier was convicted, tortured, and burned at the stake in 1634, while the nuns gradually recovered from their possession. Similar cases erupted at the Convent of Sainte Elizabeth in Louviers in 1643, where nuns accused their confessor of conducting satanic masses and forcing them to participate in Sabbath orgies. The priest, Thomas Boulet, was burned at the stake, and his alleged accomplice, Sister Madeleine Bavant, was imprisoned for life after confessing under torture to having sexual relations with demons who appeared as handsome young men. Her confession, published in sensational pamphlets, described demonic lovers who knew more of carnal pleasure than any mortal man could teach. Whether these women were victims of abuse by predatory priests, suffering from psychological disturbances, or cynically manipulating fears of witchcraft remains hotly contested. The wealth concentrated in convents created opportunities for corruption that rivaled any secular institution. By the 14th century, major abbeys controlled assets worth hundreds of thousands of florins, generating temptations that vows of poverty could not always withstand. The case of the Abbey of Quedlinburg exemplifies how sacred institutions could become centers of financial malfeasance. In 1335, Abbess Agnes von Meissen was discovered to have embezzled over 12,000 marks from the abbey treasury, using the funds to build a private palace, maintain a stable of horses, and loan money at interest to noble families, a practice forbidden to religious institutions. When confronted, Agnes claimed the expenditures were legitimate administrative costs, but account books proved otherwise. She had been systematically falsifying records for over a decade, creating phantom expenses and pocketing the difference. The scandal forced her resignation, though her aristocratic connections prevented criminal prosecution. At the Benedictine Abbey of Ramsey in England, the 1439 visitation uncovered that the prior had sold the abbey's silver plate and vestments, mortgaged productive lands, and accumulated debts of over £800 more than 5 years of the abbey's income. He had used the money to entertain lavishly, maintain mistresses, and speculate in wool trading. Italian convents became particularly notorious for financial irregularities as they grew wealthier and more politically connected. The convent of San Pier Maggiore in Florence managed an investment portfolio by the 15th century, lending money to merchants, speculating in real estate, and engaging in the silk trade through intermediaries. While not strictly illegal, such activities contradicted monastic ideals and created conflicts of interest. When the abbess of San Pier Maggiore in 1467 was found to have accepted bribes from families seeking advantageous positions for their daughters, the resulting investigation revealed a systematic economy of corruption. Wealthy families paid premiums to ensure their daughters received private cells, prestigious offices within the convent hierarchy, or exemptions from manual labor. The abbess maintained a price list: 50 florins for a private cell, 100 florins for appointment as sacristan, 200 florins for the position of cellarer, which controlled the convent's finances and food supplies. The most coveted position, chantress, who directed the choir, cost 300 florins. This simony, the buying and selling of spiritual offices, was expressly forbidden by canon law, yet it flourished because everyone benefited. The convent gained revenue, families secured comfortable positions for their daughters, and the abbess enriched herself through commissions. Rivalry between religious houses sometimes descended into behavior more befitting secular powers than spiritual institutions. The Abbey of Fontevraud and the Abbey of La Trinité in Poitiers engaged in a 50-year dispute over control of a lucrative grain market in the town of Saumur, beginning in 1247. The conflict involved bribed officials, forged documents, and on one memorable occasion in 1253, armed servants from both abbeys brawling in the marketplace over who had the right to collect tolls. The abbess of Fontevraud excommunicated the abbess of La Trinité, who responded by excommunicating her rival right back, creating the absurd spectacle of two supposedly holy women trading spiritual curses like merchants haggling over prices. Papal intervention was required to resolve the dispute in 1297, with Pope Boniface VIII sarcastically noting that we had thought these houses consecrated to prayer, not commerce and conflict. In Spain, the rivalry between Las Huelgas and the monastery of Santo Domingo de Silos over mining rights in the Cantabrian mountains escalated to violence in 1312, when armed men employed by Las Huelgas attacked and burned a silos granary, stealing 3 years' worth of stored grain. The abbess of Las Huelgas claimed the attack was justified retaliation for Silos's encroachment on her territorial rights, essentially arguing that might made right a position more suited to feudal lords than religious superiors. When scandals could no longer be ignored, the machinery of ecclesiastical investigation and punishment ground into motion with often terrifying consequences. The process of discovering and prosecuting convent misdeeds reveals much about medieval power dynamics, gender, and the Church's anxiety about controlling female sexuality and autonomy. Episcopal visitations were the primary mechanism of oversight, with bishops or their representatives periodically inspecting religious houses to ensure compliance with rules. These visitations ranged from perfunctory formalities to intensive interrogations. The 1441 visitation of Catesby Priory in Northamptonshire exemplifies the latter. The bishop examined each nun individually, asking detailed questions about the prioress's governance, the state of discipline, whether any had left the cloister without permission, whether any were pregnant or had been pregnant. The nuns were questioned separately to prevent collusion, and testimony was recorded by notaries. When several nuns at Catesby accused the prioress of keeping a lover in a house adjacent to the priory, the bishop launched a fuller investigation, interviewing servants, examining financial records, and even inspecting the prioress's private quarters where he found evidence of masculine habitation. The prioress was deposed and sentenced to perpetual imprisonment in a cell within the priory, confined for the remaining 12 years of her life. Torture was rarely used in convent investigations within England and France, but in Italian and Spanish territories, the Inquisition's methods applied to religious as well as laity when heresy was suspected. The case of Sister Lucrezia from the convent of San Silvestro in Venice illustrates the progression from suspicion to condemnation. In 1574, fellow nuns denounced her to the Holy Office for claiming that she had mystical visions in which God told her that sexual pleasure was not sinful if experienced in a state of grace. The Inquisition arrested Lucrezia and subjected her to interrogation, during which she reportedly elaborated her theology of sanctified sexuality, arguing that since God created the body and its capacities for pleasure, enjoying those pleasures while in a state of divine love could not be sinful. The inquisitors deemed this obvious heresy, a dangerous blending of Gnostic antinomianism with personal delusion. When Lucrezia refused to recant, she was shown the instruments of torture, the rack, the strappado, the thumbscrews, and warned that these would be applied if she persisted in error. According to trial records, she recanted within moments of seeing the devices, sobbing that, "I abjure all heresies and submit myself to Holy Mother Church." She was sentenced to 5 years of strict confinement in a penitential cell, required to wear penitential garb, and forbidden from receiving communion except at Easter. Public punishment served both to penalize offenders and to demonstrate institutional authority. When Sister Isabella Sforza of the Milanese convent of Santa Caterina was convicted in 1498 of bearing 2 children by the convent's chaplain, her punishment was designed for maximum humiliation. She was stripped of her habit in the presence of the entire community, dressed in a coarse penitential gown, and paraded through Milan's streets to the cathedral, where she performed public penance, kneeling on the cathedral steps for 3 hours while a herald proclaimed her sins. She was then permanently enclosed in a tiny cell within the convent, a room barely 6 feet square with a single high window where she would spend the remaining 8 years of her life. The chaplain, by contrast, was merely transferred to a distant parish and required to perform a year of fasting and additional prayers. a disparity that reveals the gendered nature of punishment. Women bore the primary blame and heaviest penalties for sexual transgressions, even when men had initiated or coerced them. Execution for convent scandals was rare but not unknown, particularly when religious and sexual transgressions intersected with accusations of witchcraft or heresy. In 1441, a nun named Pierina de Bugatis from Lombardy was burned at the stake for claiming that she had attended a Society of Diana, where women worshipped a goddess and celebrated with feasting and dancing. Her confession, obtained through torture, described nocturnal gatherings where participants flew through the air, transformed into animals, and engaged in sexual orgies. Whether Pierina was practicing some form of folk religion, suffering from delusions, or simply telling inquisitors what they wanted to hear remains unknowable, but her execution demonstrates the lethal stakes of religious nonconformity. Similarly, when two nuns from the convent of San Domenico in Bologna were convicted in 1375 of practicing necromancy and attempting to conjure demons to harm the abbess who had disciplined them, both were handed over to secular authorities and burned. The trial records describe how they had allegedly created wax figurines of the abbess, stuck them with pins while reciting incantations, and buried them beneath the chapel floor. Whether they actually performed these acts or were victims of paranoid accusations is uncertain, but the verdict was death. The psychological toll of enforced enclosure, frustrated desires, and constant surveillance created environments where scandals festered. Modern historians have debated whether we should view medieval nuns who violated their vows as sinners, victims, or rebels against oppressive patriarchal structures. The truth likely encompasses all three, varying by individual circumstance. What remains undeniable is that behind the sacred walls, human passions, love, lust, ambition, greed, jealousy persisted despite vows meant to transcend them. As the anonymous author of a 15th-century Italian chronicle observed with sardonic wisdom, "They may lock the gates and bar the windows, but no wall can contain the human heart, which goes where it will despite all prohibitions." The spectacular scandals that occasionally erupted into public view represented only the visible fraction of a much larger reality: that convents were human institutions, subject to all the frailties, corruptions, and complications that humanity entails, regardless of the sanctity of the vows taken within them. The smell of burning parchment filled the scriptorium of Sant'Ambrogio della Massima in Rome on a winter morning in 1589. Sister Flaminia Bacci watched as the papal commissioners fed decades of convent records into the flames, page after page curling into ash. Among them were detailed accounts of the abbess's financial dealings, letters exchanged between nuns and their lovers, and testimony from an investigation that had rocked the institution 7 years earlier. By sunset, 40 years of institutional memory had been reduced to smoke and silence. This scene, repeated across Catholic Europe during the Counter-Reformation, represents one of history's most systematic campaigns to erase inconvenient truths about religious life. The Church's relationship with its own scandals has always been one of strategic amnesia. When investigators uncovered evidence of sexual misconduct at the Convent of San Benedetto in Conversano in 1611, Church officials didn't simply punish the guilty parties. They confiscated and destroyed the convent's entire archive, dating back to its foundation in 1266. The official explanation claimed the records were damaged by moisture and illegible, but contemporary letters between bishops reveal a more calculated motive. Cardinal Flaminio Piatti wrote to his colleague in Naples that certain documents contained matters so vile and contrary to the dignity of our Holy Mother Church that their continued existence serves only the devil's purpose. This pattern of suppression operated on multiple levels. At the most basic, incriminating documents were physically destroyed. But the Church also developed more sophisticated methods of historical revision. Records that couldn't be destroyed were simply reclassified as lost in catalogue systems. Damaging testimony was recopied by scribes with crucial passages omitted or altered. The Vatican's secret archives contain numerous examples of medieval convent inspections, where later hands have scratched out names, crossed through accusations, or pasted new text over old. In one remarkable case from the monastery of Santa Clara in Coimbra, Portugal, investigators in the 1972 used ultraviolet light to reveal that an entire page describing sexual relationships between nuns had been bleached with lye and rewritten as an innocuous list of kitchen supplies. Even when scandals were too public to completely erase, the Church deployed narrative control. The infamous case of Benedetta Carlini, abbess of the Theatine Convent in Pescia, illustrates this perfectly. In the 1622, Carlini claimed mystical visions and exhibited stigmata, attracting pilgrims and donations. But an ecclesiastical investigation revealed she had been engaged in a sexual relationship with another nun, Sister Bartolomea Crivelli, for years. The Church's response was telling. Rather than publicize the full scope of the scandal, they quietly removed Carlini from power, imprisoned her within the convent for the remaining 35 years of her life, and rewrote the official record to describe her simply as suffering from demonic delusions. The sexual component vanished from church documents, only to be rediscovered by historian Judith Brown in the Florentine archives in 1986. The 20th century has witnessed an archaeological and archival revolution that has systematically undermined centuries of careful suppression. Modern historians, armed with new methodologies, have become forensic investigators of institutional memory, finding what was meant to stay hidden. When researchers gained access to previously restricted sections of diocesan archives across Europe in the 1960s and 1970s, they discovered that medieval convent life was far more complex and contradictory than official hagiographies suggested. The excavation of the medieval convent of San Pietro in Vincoli in Cambridge, England, between 2008 and 2011 provided physical evidence that complemented documentary discoveries. Archaeologists found evidence of tunnels connecting the convent to nearby properties, hidden chambers beneath the chapel, and most remarkably, the remains of 3 newborn infants buried beneath the refectory floor. Carbon dating placed them in the late 14th century, during a period when official records described the convent as an exemplary institution. The skeletons told a story the archives had been scrubbed of. Digital humanities have accelerated these revelations. In 2019, researchers at the University of Bologna used machine learning algorithms to analyze writing patterns in medieval manuscripts, identifying where different scribes had altered documents is less than #0. 4# is greater than applied to the records of Italian convents. The technology revealed systematic patterns of revision concentrated in the 16th and 17th centuries, coinciding exactly with the Counter-Reformation's campaign to reform religious houses. Passages describing economic irregularities, unauthorized departures from enclosure, and particular friendships between nuns showed evidence of being rewritten by different hands decades or even centuries after the original composition. The gradual revelation of convent scandals profoundly shaped European literature and visual culture, often in ways that reflected contemporary anxieties rather than historical accuracy. Denis Diderot's 1796 novel La Religieuse transformed the corrupted convent into a Gothic nightmare, complete with a predatory lesbian mother superior, a text so inflammatory it remained banned in France until 1966. Yet, Diderot drew directly from documented cases like that of Suzanne Simonin, who had sued to be released from her forced vows in 1758, and whose legal testimony revealed abuse and coercion within her Parisian convent. And so, the candlelight of our journey through sins and secrets in medieval convents fades. Behind those stone walls and whispered prayers hid confessions, far less divine desires, betrayals, forbidden love, and the eternal struggle between faith and flesh. From Hildegard of Bingen's celestial visions in the 12th century to the scandal of Sister Benedetta Carlini in 17th century Italy, history reminds us that even sacred places have shadows. One anonymous nun once wrote in her diary, "Where souls are caged, sins learn to sing." Perhaps sin was never the opposite of sanctity, merely its reflection in a candle's trembling flame. Thank you for watching. And if the mysteries of the past still haunt your thoughts, well, that's what secrets are meant to do. Until next time, may your faith be strong and your curiosity strong.